Welcome to Wake, a cold reading of James Joyce's Finnegans Wake, just to hear it out loud. Join Toby Malone and TJ Young, along with some special friends, as we puzzle our way through what we once thought was an unreadable book to produce a surprisingly listenable podcast. Welcome to a bonus episode of Wake, the podcast that paints in Technicolor while always colouring outside the lines, as we steadfastly drive towards fulfilling a long-held bucket list item, reading James Joyce's Finnegans Wake out loud, just once. I'm your host, Toby Malone, joined once more by the man who knows his way around artistic expression better than most, TJ Young. Hi, TJ.
Oh, hi, Toby. How are you today?
I'm great. I'm really good. I'm looking forward to getting back to school starting. No, not everyone is. Not everyone in my house is. I don't know how you're feeling about classes going back.
If they didn't have to happen, that'd be fine. But, once I get in the classroom, I'll be good.
Yeah. It's all those students. That's the reason to do it.
Absolutely.
So a question for you. Have you ever tried your hand at visual art? Is visual art anything that's been part of your life?
Yeah, in elementary school, I actually went to a creative arts elementary school where we had to do dance, music, theater, and art. So I've done the throwing of clay, the still life sketches, all that stuff. I've even tried my hand at creating a comic book. I can tell you that if someone said, "Draw me this right now or die," I would say, "And all my things are bequeathed to." It's just nothing that really stuck, and I bought the how to draw books and, did the whole thing. Even with my iPad, I was like, maybe I'm a digital artist. And I was like, I am not, which is totally fine.
Yeah.
But I have a great appreciation for art. It's all over my house. And there's actually a Three Rivers Arts Festival here in Pittsburgh that I go to every year and make sure to buy at least 3 authentic prints directly from the artist.
Nice.
Because, I was like, anytime someone can do something that I absolutely cannot, I'm like, yes, I will. Yeah. I will support you in every way possible.
Absolutely. I have a similar kind of. When I was a kid, I had a real drive towards visual art and was trying to do. I did cartooning classes and was really hoping that would be. But I just didn't have. My hands didn't do the things that my brain wanted it to do. So it never really stuck. But the reason why we're talking about visual art today is we have an esteemed guest with us, and we're thrilled to have him here on the podcast, a purist in the nicest possible sense and lifelong Wakean. It's writer, artist, scholar, Renaissance man, Peter O'Brien. Welcome, Peter.
Welcome to you too, and thank you so much. I'm really enjoying this already. You guys are great.
Fantastic. Yeah, we're so glad to have you here. And we found that the best part of this podcast has been all of the people we've met along the way who share this interest in this book and in this project, and people have been so encouraging. And you were one of the people who we met on Instagram, and your work is fascinating. So can you tell us a little bit about yourself, about your background, where you came from?
Sure. I'll give you a number to start with, which you might find intriguing. I am one of 22 children. It's
a very Irish thing right there, isn't it?
Oh, it is. The last name is O'Brien. So yeah, I have 9 brothers and sisters and 12 stepbrothers and sisters.
Oh, goodness.
Born in New York, but spent most of my time in Canada, although I did go back to school to university at the University of Notre Dame in South Bend, Indiana. And I went to art school. I've always been interested in words, but also the connection between words and all sorts of other ways to express oneself. And and at the moment I've just embarked on an opera.
Yes, and we're going to get to talk about that at great length a little bit later on. That's amazing. Yeah,
a completely new thing for me because I'm really not a musical person. But I guess the one thing that I would really say about Finnegans Wake, it is infinitely expandable. It is such a curious, strange, inviting series of words that you can do whatever the hell you want with it. Mm-hmm. It really is a very open and inviting document. So I guess that would be how I would begin this beast.
Yeah, absolutely. So I read an article you wrote in the Globe and Mail in 2018 that you said that you've been, quote, butting my head up against Joyce for 40 years. So can you tell us a little bit about where you first came to Joyce?
Sure, I need to update
where the butting began?
I need to update that because now it's been about, 47 years or so.
Right.
just to be clear. I was always a reader, always had books around, unlike the rest of my family, who really, I don't even know if some of them can read. But I, for whatever reason, I was always interested in reading. And I did spend 1 year in Dublin, my third year university. And in fact, I ended up studying Joyce with Roland McHugh.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So yeah, anybody who knows Joyce immediately knows Roland McHugh, who
He of the
did
annotations, yeah.
annotations to Finnegans Wake. Exactly. He was a curious fellow, Roland McHugh. I mean, he really was. That's maybe for another conversation. But among other things, not because he had a photographic memory, but he ended up being so familiar with the book, reading it so constantly, that he ended up memorizing Finnegans Wake.
Oh, wow.
And I think it's fair to say this is not a stretch. There is no more difficult book in any language that is more difficult to memorize than Finnegans Wake, and he did that.
Oh.
So we really read in that class in Dublin. We were really reading Ulysses.
Mm-hmm.
Spent a little time with some previous books, Dubliners and Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. Lots of time on Ulysses, and then we did a couple of classes with Finnegans Wake, because the class was all saying, "Hey, we need to know a little bit about this crazy book that really nobody reads."
Right.
So that was my first exposure to Finnegans Wake. And again, I was whatever, I was 20 years old, something like that.
Right. It's amazing, just the idea of that memorization. I mean, TJ, I don't know if you. I mean, you and I have been really puzzling over this text over the last 7 months, and really sort of coming up against roadblocks. So, TJ, what's your take on
Yeah, I
trying to
mean,
memorize this?
I think about when I listen to music in other languages, I do memorize the lyrics, but that comes from just repetition of hearing it and singing it to, the rhythm and the syncopation of the music. Without any sort of audio sort of accompaniment to help me memorize this book, my mind cannot wrap around the logistics of it.
Yeah, yeah, it's crazy. We had I was able to witness Richard Hart perform part of the Wake at a recent reading here in Toronto, and he had rehearsed it enough that he was able to engage with the audience, look out to the audience as he was reading. So he'd memorized it in part, but just the idea, the amount of repetition that it would take to lock it all in, and 628 pages worth.
Well, and also you obviously have to catch the music of the language.
Yeah.
Sure.
I did spend a little time studying and thinking a lot about Glenn Gould, who the pianist, and it's sort of interesting that when he was memorizing a piece of music, sometimes he would ask his house cleaner to play some noise in the background, a stupid television show, and do some vacuuming. And just kind of, so for whatever reason, Glenn Gould needed a lot of noise in order to memorize things. And by the way, in a, let's say a 45-minute piece that he was memorizing, there are, give or take, about 70,000 to 80,000 individual piano notes.
Yeah.
So I'm just in awe of anybody playing music who has to memorize that. But there is a rhythm, there is a logic, there is a progression. And that's why, coming back to Finnegans Wake, memorizing it is so idiosyncratic.
Right.
There is really nothing else like it at all. It really does set up a whole series of roadblocks, laneways, I don't know, ladders, holes in the ground that you really have to navigate. So I have to say, I also am amazed that anybody without a photographic memory could actually memorize Finnegans Wake, and he did.
Yeah,
Wow.
I'm thinking about so I used to play music, and I did drum corps, I did concert band, and I would memorize 13-minute shows, and then I'd have the sheet music in front of me, but when I was playing in the concert band, I knew the music, right? I knew what buttons to press, I knew how loud I was supposed to play, I knew all that stuff, but so much of that did come from the ability sometimes to just be able to say, I need to hear the part. okay, that's what's supposed to be.
Right.
Um, Even when I was acting, I think the longest show I memorized was probably 2.5 hours. But even then, I'm not speaking the whole entire time.
Yeah.
A lot of it is triggered by someone else said a thing. I know that this is my response. Um, but to go off the cuff by yourself is just a fascinating thing. But it also shows that how sticky language can be if you really, really work at it,
Hmm.
right? And how there are people who can recite the first chapter of Moby Dick, who can, they're like all there's all different things. I also think about I used to be able to recite exactly the first 37 minutes of the first Toy Story. I don't know why, but like,
In
Hey,
minute
hey
38,
TJ,
they lost you.
TJ,
yeah.
if I were you, I wouldn't let that get out. Just to let you know. But you, as far as I'm concerned, you can hide that if you want to.
Well,
Okay.
luckily I teach at a theater school, so all the kids are like, "That's great."
I
Okay.
think I think it's a really interesting point you make though, TJ, is the idea that you're not trying to memorize the whole thing. You're trying to memorize the next thing, and you're trying to
Yeah,
memorize the line that is sparked by the previous line, as opposed to trying to do the entire thing. It's like I remember when I was an actor coming in, and you think, how do I learn this role? This is giant. Like I remember playing the younger Loman son in Death of a Salesman, which is a big show. And you go,
it
well, on the
is.
first day of rehearsal, you go, well, how could we possibly say all of this? On the first day of rehearsal, it feels impossible. But then it's that repetition and rehearsal, and then you learn bit by bit, and then some scenes are good, and then some scenes are harder, and then eventually it slots into place because you remember what the line is, and then what the next line is, and the next line is. And something we often say about the challenge of reading the Wake is very much like, how do you eat an elephant one bite at a time? Is you don't, if you look at the totality of the 628 pages, which most people do, they pick up the tome and then they say it's too hard and they put it down. But if you say, well, just try the next line, just try the next paragraph, eventually you make progress. And like we're 570 something pages into 628 pages. We're nearly finished the book. I don't think we've got all of the meaning that is in there, obviously, but we've certainly managed it. So yeah, I feel as though thinking about the next line is probably the the way to get through this, or memorize it if you really really want to.
And yet, there's all sorts of things that can trip you up as you're doing that. For
Mm.
example, Toby, as you were speaking, you came across a little spot in your past few words where you wanted to say something like sparked or
Mm.
spurred.
Yeah.
And in fact, you said both. You kind of ate the half you ate the back half of both of those words, sparked and spurred, which was again, it's a great little moment of how do we speak? What brings
Yeah.
us to the
It's
next
wonderful.
word? And your brain obviously was simultaneously trying to say, oh, should my next word be sparked or spurred?
Yeah.
So you kind of mix them up. And in fact, that's what Joyce does constantly, obviously.
Yeah.
And he does it quite consciously. But it is a curious thing how our brains can be on multiple tracks at the same time.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. Well, now I can't edit out my speaking mistake. I was like, well, I'll
Well,
cut that bit out, but now I
sorry,
can't.
just to be clear, it's not
Yeah.
a mistake at all. In fact,
Okay.
it's the
Good point.
opposite because you're really gathering two things that are quite distinct and combining them
Hmm.
almost unconsciously and instantaneously. So, if anything, it's not a mistake at all.
I appreciate that.
I hope that
Yes.
doesn't
No.
sound like a compliment. I'm not trying to compliment you. I'm just
No.
saying
No. Of
that's
course
just
not.
the crazy way our brains work,
Yeah,
and
it's
language
that's a
works.
really brilliant point. Absolutely. So for you, what is it about Joyce that keeps you coming back to the well? Why 47 years of reading this? Do we have 47 years ahead of us of coming back to this? Because we feel we're nearly finished, and I get a feeling that the wake isn't finished with us.
Okay, I have a challenging response to what you just said. And that is the whole idea about reading the wake cold or once. I find that very curious. And I
Hmm.
say this with obvious infinite sympathy and enthusiasm for what you're doing. But you probably know the story that somebody once said to Joyce he wanted to write a book that 1 million people would read. And Joyce, in a relatively convoluted response to that, said what he wanted to do was to write a book that one person would read 1,000,000 times. So again, what
Love that.
language is, how we absorb it, can we absorb it? I just think it's an interesting question for all of us. We always ask these questions of ourselves. Sometimes they're not so articulate, but um, it is an interesting idea to constantly read. And as you also know, Joyce wanted people to dedicate their lives to his writing. He wanted them to, as Finnegans Wake is circular, he wanted them to read it, get to the quote unquote end, and then start again at the quote unquote beginning, and just keep going. So I am getting around to the answer to your question, which is I think it's an infinitely deep well of wit, charm, sex, craziness, multitudinous languages, always keeping you off kilter, always telling you new things. And I guess the other simple response to your question is I would stop reading it if I was bored with it.
Right.
And I don't think any of us should continue to read if we're bored. Like if you're bored with Dante, stop reading Dante. I
Right.
think that's pretty unlikely. You probably know that Samuel Johnson, talking about London, said, he who is tired of London is tired of life.
Right.
So if you get tired of Finnegans Wake, stop reading it. For me, I don't think that's going to happen, or it sure as hell hasn't happened yet. And even pages that I've spent some time with illustrating, talking about, thinking about, sometimes memorizing, there's always something new there. So that's the beginning of an answer for you.
Yeah, and it's one thing that we've noticed is that it's a kind of book where you can always, almost whenever you open it, you can almost always find the thing you're looking for. And TJ and I are always reading on different kinds of levels, and we notice different things all the time. And certain kinds of things where sometimes one of us will pick out a literary reference to a novel or a play that is important to us, and sometimes we'll focus on the scatological humor or focus on the references to scandalous behavior in the park and the sexual stuff, and sometimes things will pop out to us, but sometimes it'll be certain names or certain events or certain things like that. And it's almost like when you're getting married, all you notice on all media is people getting married, or when you buy a white van, all you see on the street are white vans. And so it's one of those interesting things where it becomes like, I almost think it's like the mirror in Harry Potter, where you look into it and you see whatever you desire.
Yeah.
It's that idea that you can basically take from it whatever you want. You can allow your brain to pull out, and I think that's fascinating.
I've always loved that very simple, very elemental phrase, when you have a hammer in your hand, everything looks like a nail.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I completely agree with you. And that is certainly the other thing you probably know that, Virgil's Aeneid, it has its own special qualities where the idea is you can open up the Aeneid at any page and you will find that, yeah, you're kind of supposed to do it just one page, but you can do it, of course, multitudinous times. The idea is you open up the Aeneid and you find that passage which is completely relevant to you at that instant in your life, and that can really change the rest of your life. I mean, it is such a rich text. So, if it works for Virgil, I think it can also work for Finnegans Wake and for James Joyce. Certainly, you're right. There's, in fact, if anything, it's even, I wouldn't say more interesting than Virgil, but with Joyce, because every word has, again, multitude of meanings, this idea of finding what you're looking for is, I hope this doesn't belittle it. It's really easy with Joyce because there's so much in the book. It's easy to find what you're looking for because the bloody text is just so full, overwhelmingly fertile with all sorts of things. So, in
Yeah,
brief, yeah.
and it's interesting because over the holiday break we released an episode about Finnegans Wake and Guinness, and I thought, well, I'll go into the Wake and pull out all the references to Guinness. There must be a handful, and there are 80 references to Guinness in the Wake, and we couldn't believe just this one. I mean, obviously Guinness has an outsized presence in Dublin life, but at the same time, the fact that we were able to pull out all these references so cunningly hidden that you would never find them unless you were using something like Fuit to get it out.
Right.
And and we'll talk a little later about how just how many references to opera there are in the Wake. But yeah, it's crazy how much is buried in there, and you look at a word from one angle and it means certain thing, and then you look at it from another angle and it's another, and so it sends you down a completely different rabbit hole.
The other thing, of course, Joyce, it sounds simple to say, but he really understood words and the histories of individual words. And you probably know that there are, many words within our history that have their meanings have changed over the years. The word nice, just that simple word nice, which we think of as kind of a bland, know nothing, kind of a simple word.
Right.
It has gone through so many different derivations in its own lifespan.
Mm-hmm.
It right now it means kind of gentle and, just the word that we know, but it's gone through all sorts of meanings, sometimes diametrically opposed to what the previous generation understood by that word nice. I wrote a book on my daughter and I studying Latin together. So I did sometimes a little bit of research on some individual words. And really, if you want to have some fun, look up the etymology and the various meanings of a simple word like nice. And you go, gee, it means this and the opposite and this and that. In 1680, it meant this, but in 1692, it meant something else. Now it's kind of just a nice, simple, non-challenging word, but it's changed.
That's such a fascinating point, because the OED is full of references to literary works that first use certain kinds of words. So in my previous life, I was a Shakespearean, and so a lot of people love to point out how many words Shakespeare quote unquote coined, which I think is nonsense, because Shakespeare didn't make up any words. He just wrote them down for the first time and then they put them into the dictionary. And so he was certainly writing them down for the first time, but he didn't come up with the word assassination. I mean, come on. But the idea of its usage in a literary sense is what gives it its meaning. Whereas someone flipping the meaning, like what Joyce does, can give it an alternate meaning. And sometimes that can show up in the OED as an alternate meaning, as validated by its presence in literature. And I always think about the Shakespearean term naughty, which to us now is something, a naughty child is not, naughty child means mischievous. Whereas for Shakespeare, it meant a man who was of naught. You were a nothing. You were a low, horrible person. And so Joyce was doing those kind of things all the time, really interrogating that and pushing back on this idea that the English language was complete and set, but the English language is continuing to evolve. And we've talked a lot about how much it's evolved in contemporary slang and in contemporary vernacular. But he's really sort of pushing the envelope and trying to push us ahead by a couple of 100 years by really working with this language.
The other thing, again, I just love any reference to the OED, of course, but you probably know that there are some words that take up 2 or 3 or 4 pages of the OED just because. But my favorite word, it's sort of one of my favorite words, is the word set. S-E-T. Simple word. Do you know how many pages the word set takes up in the OED? 28 pages.
Oh, wow.
Because it's a verb and a noun and different. So, these words, they grow as you investigate them.
Right.
And and again, when I say the OED, I don't mean the abbreviated one. I'm talking about the full monster OED. And so just look up the word set one of these days when you think, wow, there's just one meaning for each word. Again, it's there's a multitude of meanings. So
I think that is one thing that I think is important about Finnegans Wake, especially as an educator, is to get my students out of the head of they understand everything the language is capable of. I often, it's really funny because oftentimes I'll go into class and I'll say a word that I think is mundane. And they're like, wait, what's that? And I'm like, well, it could be used in this case, this case, this case, and probably this case. And they're like, how'd you come across that word? I'm like, I read it, you know? Um, and I think that taking the time to read this and understand all the intersections it has, especially with different languages, is a monumental but almost crucial task. Like we were reading through, and I was taking doing Swahili classes on Duolingo because that's what you do, right? And there were words I was like, wait, this is a derivative of the Swahili word that means this thing here. And the thing that continues to amaze me is that there was no internet. You know, there's a level of just like deep scholarship and knowledge that's on display in the text that I am continuously appreciating.
And as you and all your listeners know, Joyce has, give or take, it really is give or take, 80 or so languages, including
Mhm.
Kiswahili. It's one of the languages in the Wake, and you can trace it
Yeah.
through the Wake. Never mind ancient Greek and some invented languages that he came up with. Volapük is another language that it's a synthetic language, but he used that in the Wake too. So yeah, it is. I think we've kind of answered your question. Why would anybody spend any time with the Wake, and is it possible to read a book for 47 years?
Mhm.
I almost said 74 years. Interesting. Very
Interesting.
interesting.
Yeah, there you go. Have that ahead of you. Well, and this is what I find we've found with our conversations on the Wake, and we've also found with our reading of the Wake, is that it unfolds itself. And you ask a simple question, and suddenly we've been talking for 15 minutes, and every answer has led to another point or another idea or another query or another angle. And that's exactly what's happening throughout the Wake. It's really it's kind of incredible how it shows itself to you in that way.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've read a lot of people online saying, how did Joyce do all this? How did Joyce come up with these 80 languages? Like TJ said, there was no internet. So right now, if we wanted to write a, Joyce-esque uh, text, we could put it in ChatGPT and come up with something that would approximate a very shallow version of what Joyce is doing. But what it would do is it would give you a whole bunch of crazy words that look crazy, but there's no depth to it. Whereas Joyce has really thought this through and really tried to deepen every single word. And it always takes me back to conversations I had with earlier professors I asked them questions about the Shakespearean authorship question, about people who believe that Shakespeare couldn't have written Shakespeare because he wasn't educated and he was just a man, and how could he have written 39 plays and written the greatest plays ever written in the English language, and they still endure over 400 years. And I said to him, it doesn't make sense. And I'd read some of the authorship things, and he said, the problem is that people can't bear to think about genius. They can't bear to acknowledge genius, because if they acknowledge that someone is a genius, then they have to acknowledge that they are not a genius. And it's like a Mozart and Salieri thing, where Mozart could be the man he was, but create what he created. Salieri really wanted it, really, really, really wanted it, but just couldn't touch it. And I think Joyce is a similar kind of thing. He was touched on the head in a certain way and was able to retain things, was able to communicate things without the tools that we have now. It's quite incredible that it exists. But the more we delve in, the more I go, oh, this is genius. It's that simple, which
Oh,
of course is not simple, but
no, completely understood. And I do think there are people, you can, whatever word you want to use, more context, genius is an okay word, who really know more than some other people. And, there are carpenters and plumbers who know about their worlds infinitely better than I know about their worlds. And they can do stuff that I can't even imagine. Music is a big thing. I could not find middle C on a piano. Paid me $100, and boy, TJ really chuckled at that. But it's true, TJ. I'm not joking. I can't. I That's just not in my can. I just don't get it. But I can give you, poems by Tennyson or Shakespeare or whatever. But if you asked me to do some electrical work at your place, I'd probably say you should pick a different electrician. So people do have a level of incredible knowledge, and we can call it genius in certain things and not in other things. So and Joyce just happened to really, really understand language. And when I say language, I mean words, punctuation, letters, individual
Mhm.
letters. I think better than anybody else who has ever lived, and I include Virgil and Dante and Emily Dickinson and George Eliot and T.S. Eliot in that phrase. Like, I don't think anybody understood language better than Joyce. I think you can say Shakespeare understood metaphor. I think you can say Ovid understood mythology better. Almost. Dante understood the religious and political machinations. Uh, but and all that's true. But I think just for language, just for words, I do not think anybody has understood language, words, punctuation, letters better than that fellow James Joyce. And to me, that's interesting.
It is. It's fascinating. It's so wonderful. Yeah, I'd love to move on to talk about how you've built on your interest in the text. When we first met on Instagram, I was fascinated with your artwork that you've done that has been built out of the wake. And I'm going to link to this in the show notes. I really hope everyone goes and checks out Peter's art because it's really quite incredible. You've got a long-term take on Finnegans Wake, which is a beautifully titled collection called Lots of Fun at Finnegans Wake, and this certainly is fun. So can you just describe this project that you've got here? Because we're looking at these prints right now, and they're just mind-boggling.
Okay, my answer to you is I cannot describe it. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
No, I can't and I won't. But having said that, I've always been interested in visual art. Even as a kid, I was always interested in paintings and, studying some other stuff or studying, looking at books
Mm-hmm.
that had some art in it. And after university, I did go to art school, the Banff School of Fine Art, where I did clay. And so nice to get my hands, in that mud. But I've always been interested in visual art. And then about, I don't know, 10 years ago or so, I had a little page where I, I had printed out a page of Finnegans Wake with lots of space between the lines.
Mm-hmm.
Lots of, the technical phrase is leading, lots of leading between the lines. And I started to just doodle and add words between those lines, and then those little drawings called letters, they sort of expanded a little bit, and so I added a little bit more, and then I added some colors, different kinds of colors, and then there was a margin around the page, so I put a few little something or other, little graphic-y things there, and 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 then I looked at it and I went, oh, this kind of helps me understand the page that I was looking at because I was explaining the page to myself.
Mm-hmm.
So if I saw a little bit of Kiswahili or a little bit of German or a little bit of modern Greek, I would highlight that in the text, sometimes in different colors. And if it talked about in Joyce, there's just about everything. If there was some mention of a rhinoceros or a codex, I would sort of draw a little something related to that. And then as I looked at it, I went, oh, maybe I should do this for the whole bloody book, for all 628 pages, which is, of course, ludicrous, really misplaced enthusiasm, uh, really kind of silly to do. So I'm right now, as you know, because you know this, you've already used it. There are 628 pages in the book,
Mm-hmm.
and as your listeners might know, every edition is exactly the same because it's such an idiosyncratic book.
Right.
So I'm about halfway through my.
Wow.
I don't really call it illustration. I don't know
Mm-hmm.
what I call it, to tell you the truth. Um, I sometimes refer to as letterism, which
Mm-hmm.
kind of plays with this notion of pointillism for people who know Seurat or some of those other French peeps who use dots to illustrate stuff.
Right.
How's that for eloquence? Dots to illustrate stuff.
Yeah.
So I sometimes draw with the letters, and sometimes I do quite a recognizable little drawing on the page, a glass of water or a bird or whatever. And
Hmm.
sometimes I just do something quite a bit more abstract. So for me, it really helps me understand the book. I sort of slow my reading down. Uh, in the midst of all of these illustrative gestures that I make, I absolutely, the first thing I do is really explain the book to myself. So I really start there
Hmm.
and I try to explain, and then there's some extra room on the page, and that's when I sometimes put another drawing in. But yeah, by all means, it's been a quite an interesting way to combine the visual and the verbal, uh, and sort of the illustrative and intellectual, as it were.
Hmm.
So yeah, so I've been doing it for a while. I've had a various shows here and there. I had a show in Antwerp about 6 years ago. That show was 2 feet tall by 65 feet long.
Hmm.
And again, it was pages that I'd been working on. I blew them up in size a little bit, but it was quite a long, I mean that, quite a long artwork, 2 feet by 65 feet. And then I've also had some exhibitions of my artwork in Philadelphia and New York and Hong Kong and Toronto, Montreal,
Yeah,
etc.
it's
So
fascinating.
yeah, so I'm
Like
having
it,
fun with it, and it's not too intellectual. You can sort of just have fun with it. You can just enjoy the color of the
mhm.
paintings. But yeah, yeah,
Well,
and
I love.
again, the
Yeah,
book lends itself to that.
it does. It does. And it really feels like a really useful companion to the book because it's a similar kind of every time you look at one of the artworks, I'm just looking at one now, you find different things every time everywhere you look, and the different colors of a lot of the ink in different kind of ways means that you're drawn to certain areas, but then the patterns that you make. I'm just looking right now at the a limited edition print of yours called Peter the Painter, which feels you must have seen that and said, "It's me." I mean,
Hey, sorry, in Ulysses there is the phrase, "A Daniel, did I say? Nay, a Peter O'Brien." So my name is in Ulysses, and you're right.
wonderful.
When I saw that phrase, Peter the Painter, on that page, I know exactly the page you're looking at now. Absolutely. And
Yeah.
I think that's the case with a lot of people. You can see yourself
Hmm.
in in a book like this because it's an expandable, adaptable beast. So
Right.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
We when we found both of our names in the wake, we were like, oh, especially me, because my first name is Thornton, which I never see anywhere. And
Thornton Wilder.
outside of that, like in a
Okay.
text, in a text, I rarely see it. And so I was like, oh, well, here we go. Um, the thing I love about your artwork is that it seems, at least for me, it demystifies the text a little bit because it is the way that I used to interact with things that I was pondering and thinking about when I was a kid. That feels like it was stifled in grade school, where you get shunned or a finger wag for drawing and doodling around something as you're trying to understand it. And I love the way that you just leaned into that to create these things. And oftentimes I look in my notebooks, especially when I'm in deep thought, they are littered with doodles. And, because that's my brain actively taking in the information and linking what someone is saying or what I'm reading to my body so that way I can take it in fully. Yeah.
And you're doing as we talked earlier, you're doing multiple things simultaneously. Your brain, when you're doing this stuff, is very active, and you're processing letters, composing words, doing other stuff.
Yeah.
And yet there's a musicality going on in your imagination as well, because you're reading things and your voice goes up and down. And obviously you're making some graphic marks on the page. So to me, um, TJ, we talked about this notion of genius. I'm sorry, right there, you're doing three, four, five things simultaneously.
100%.
You know, so to me, I find that remarkable that that our brains can do multiple things simultaneously.
Yeah.
And you've probably, heard stories about musicians who are on stage performing a song at the same time they're composing another song in their brains at the same time that they're singing that one song.
Yeah.
Uh, and again, it's our brains are porous, and Joyce's certainly was porous, and I think that's one of the things that you can say about Finnegans Wake. It really does operate on multiple levels. The main thing is at the same time, and that to me is remarkable. To me, there's a tingling in the brain that happens, and I think each of us can sort of work on that and develop those talents. If you're only watching television for 17 hours a day, maybe not. But if you're wandering around and looking at trees and thinking about music and in the middle of a conversation with somebody and thinking about something that your mother said to you, 42 years ago, all of that stuff can happen simultaneously. And it does happen simultaneously. So that to me, I think, is the great thing about Finnegans Wake. It is, and I'm sorry, I'm coming back, Toby, to your question earlier. Like, can can you do this with any book for 47 years? I think the answer is yes. Not every book, because sometimes you might read a book once or twice or 8 times, and you can sort of say, okay, I think I got it. But Finnegans Wake is not that book. Finnegans Wake, it really does change each time you look at it. It changes you each time you look at it. It expands, it grows as you're working with it. So to me, I guess that's one of the reasons why I'm sort of interested in talking to you guys, because Finnegans Wake is a really infinitely satisfying, fulfilling, exciting book. Sorry to use those kind of nebulous terms, but it's a pretty great book. How's that? It's a pretty great book.
It is, and you're really drawing so much out of it, so many different things, and
Sorry, did you
the way.
say drawing out of it? Really? Is that really what you meant to say? Did you really want to use that word
Wow.
to
He
draw?
did.
Okay.
Trust me, he did.
Yeah, good,
We can't forget that he is a father. So the dad jokes just flow out of him. He is a
good.
fount of them.
I'm so pleased by that.
Yeah. No. Yes. There is. I just love so many of these different things that you are gaining this supplementary meaning, because what you're layering these additional images of trees and cups and animals and rivers on top of the text, and which is obviously reacting and responding to what Joyce wrote, but it's also expanding on it and creating a new narrative and new ways in which then it's palimpsestuous, let's say.
Palimpsestuous. Wow, I love
Yeah,
that.
sort of creating something new that could then be then. And you're obviously, not only are you making these, but you're selling these as prints that people can put up in their homes, which is maybe the best conversation starter at a party I can think of. Someone walks into your living room and sees one of these prints. That's certainly going to spark a conversation.
I thank you, and I that's kind of the idea. I had a friend who's got a couple of them, and it's kind of in his house, kind of down a stairway to his main floor. And he says, every time I pass your work, I see something different in it.
Mm-hmm.
Every time I see something a little different. And I have to say, I also use it. I'm not really a diary keeper. But I do use this artwork sometimes as a diary. For example, if I've gone to a play or an opera the night before and it's still swirling around in my little pea brain, I'll
Mm-hmm.
write about it in the midst of my quote unquote commentary on Joyce and the bits of Spanish or Portuguese that I found in it. I'll also say, oh, last night I went to see uh, whatever, Mozart, and it
Mm.
got me thinking about this, and I'm humming that little tune in my, so I sort of use it as a bit of a diary.
That's
So
And that's even more exciting to me in so many ways, because that's the dream structure that Joyce has built, which is non-linear, and it's not about staying on topic, and it's that you're using this as a way of using Joyce as a springboard to create something new, and I feel as though so much of the Wake, he starts on one topic and then flies off onto another way, and he's able to, because we're in a dream, and so the dream is in this structure. And yeah, I think that's terrific, that it's not, because one thing on quick glances, I go, okay, a lot of this is reacting to the text, which then makes you go, okay, so is this an academic illuminated text? But it's not. It's something that is much more reactive than that, which yeah.
And of course, whenever you read something really closely, you see different things. I've got to say, I always knew that there was some sex, some sensuality in Finnegans Wake. But boy, sometimes when I'm reading this book, I am just laughing out loud. I just say to
Right.
myself, how the hell did he put that in a text? Nora, his wife, was reading this, and there's chunks of there that are so spicy, if you know what I mean by spicy. And he's having a hell of a lot of fun with that. And again, on a close reading, some of those things just come out. The other thing about Joyce, and as you were speaking, I was just thinking that he was constantly expanding what he was doing, but in individual spots. So he'd always add, if there was a word or an image that he needed to add in the middle of something else, he would add it into the middle of something else. So it kind of expands a little bit like the universe at all times simultaneously. Sorry, at all times in all spaces simultaneously. It's not just expanding at the outer limits. It's expanding right from the center of whatever it is we're looking at. It's expanding as you read it, and that's the way Joyce wrote the book. He was always adding stuff. He is, there are writers who are minimalists. There are musicians. There are artists who are minimalists. Sorry, that ain't Joyce.
No.
He's a maximalist. He
Absolutely.
is a maximalist. And so sometimes I think of myself, especially when I'm doing that artwork related to this, that I am a maximalist as well. That's my instinct. And again, maybe because I have, 21 brothers and sisters and an infinite number of nieces, nephews, cousins, second cousins, blah, blah, blah. There's a lot of conversations going on simultaneously. So.
Yeah, TJ, where is your eye drawn to on these?
I'm
Yeah.
I'm absolutely in love with the one that looks like a tree, and then the negative of the tree. I just love the use of negative space there. The umbrella is also really captivating to me. I was
I've
like,
got to
this
say
is
that tree. I've done that tree 4 or 5 times throughout the project. That tree is a tree I look at every single day.
really.
When I wake up, I'm in Toronto and I'm looking out over High Park, and I looked at that tree for many, many years before I started to paint it. But I saw it this morning. When I wake up, I open my little eyes and I see that tree. So that tree is quite important to me. And so to me, it does take on a different flavor each time I do it. And you're right. I don't know why I came up with that notion of the negative tree, but I thought, oh, sorry. Well, one of the reasons you saw on that page is there. The book is, as we know, 628 pages, but a couple of those pages are blank.
Yeah.
So when I looked at that page, because I was sort of on that page, I thought, okay, this is a blank page. So I'm not going to highlight the French or the whatever, the Welsh in it, because I'm not seeing it. So what do I do there? So that page is quite, well, quote unquote, autobiographical. And also I wanted to kind of give the page itself a little room to breathe. And that's why that sort of negative page. And all I did was I just traced out the tree. And then I just drew the words around. Yeah, I mean, you see what I did. So it's a task, nothing particularly intelligent in what I did, but I had some fun with that page. Yeah.
Yeah, we would love to help you sell some of these, because these are so wonderful, and I think the Joyce community around the world would. I'm sure that many are very familiar already, but this is fantastic. It's something that we want to make sure that everyone gets to have a look at. So it's at peterobrienart.com, but I'll link to that in the show notes to make sure that everyone sees that. It's just It's fascinating. It's one of those. When I first saw it, I kind of assumed it was kind of like McLuhan's annotated text, where McLuhan goes in and makes little notes about things he's noticed, and that was what it was. And I thought, wow, you have a lot to say about this text. That's very impressive. But the fact that it's building on that, and it's not just that, but it's also allowing it to be almost writing, almost like automatic writing,
Yes.
and creating something. But with the color, it's so vibrant, so you can appreciate it as visual art, but you can also appreciate it as intellectual art. You could
Yeah.
appreciate it whether or not you've heard of Joyce or, it's brilliant.
I have to say, whenever anybody buys a piece, I then immediately customize the piece for them.
Oh,
I find maybe their spelling or their some sort of reference to them in the text, because again, it's so easy. So I put sometimes people's initials in there, or I somehow I always find something to do with the person who has just
amazing.
purchased it, and I customize it, and then that's what they get. So that's kind of fun too, because again, it's just an expandable thing, and you can see a lot in it.
And how long does it take you to make one?
Oh, yikes! I don't know, 5 to 15 hours, somewhere between there.
Right.
So
Well, it's brilliant.
yeah.
Yeah. It's terrific, and you've published articles and books on the topic, writing about what you've created, and so there's lots of content out there that you're really building on this. And in that article that you wrote in the Globe and Mail in 2018, you said this has been a 6-year project. Obviously, it's a little longer than that now.
Since then, yeah.
Is there?
And
Is
one
there
of the pages is on the cover of James Joyce Quarterly. And I have published various things about the project in various international journals.
That's amazing. Well, another project that you're working on, which is, if you've been listening to us the last 20 minutes talking about the artwork and the annotations of these texts, you've thought that's clearly the most ambitious thing Peter O'Brien is doing in regards to Joyce. Well, let me say, hold my beer, because you are currently working on an opera based on the Anna Livia episode. And I'm just going to quote you here. You say, this is my favorite part. Okay. Do you say this is an opera in 2 or more acts? Which, I mean, amazing. I love that. 2 or more acts. So, I mean, who knows? It's steeped in the Anna Livia Pluribel chapter of Finnegans Wake that draws out and upon some of the 3,000 plus references to opera that he fused into the text. So, I mean, TJ and I have worked a lot in adaptation, but we're dumbfounded right now with this idea. Tell us about Pluribel, which is your opera of the Anna Livia episode.
Well, I kind of dumbfounded this project swirling around in my little brain, and I thought, I have to say, and again, I'm not being coy or silly here. My knowledge of music is really, really minuscule. I really don't know. I never grew up playing the piano or recorder, nothing.
Amazing.
When I was in the high school play, the director, we were all in the chorus. We had the director, obviously this stayed with me and traumatized the rest of my life. She pointed at me and said, "You in the back row, please don't sing. Please,
wow.
please just mouth the words." So again, my knowledge of music is pretty crazy. So, but I recently have been going to some more music and some more operas, and just a little under 3 years ago, I decided to, why not write the libretto for an opera, which is a crazy thing to do. You mentioned Mozart earlier. Most composers work with a librettist, sort of simultaneously or one the other. But I literally, maybe a little bit like your cold reading of FW, I decided for whatever reason to write the libretto before even thinking about contacting a composer, which is really not the way you do it. It's completely backwards. So that's what I did. I wrote the libretto because I wanted to write the libretto. And as you say, it is based on the Anna Livia Pluribel chapter. It's really, really based on that 20-page chapter. I said to myself immediately, there's no way you can write an opera about Finnegans Wake. It would be hours upon hours upon hours. It's just so I just picked that one spot, which has a nice image of, again, there's lots of other people speaking, but two women talking across a river.
Mm-hmm.
And as the chapter continues, one of the women turns into a tree and the other
Mm-hmm.
woman turns into a stone. So that's the basic movement of this opera. The opera is give or take about 2.5 hours. But at the end of the opera, one of the women turns into a tree and one of the women turns into a stone. Um, about a year ago, I contacted a composer, very interesting woman named Augusta Reed Thomas. Reed, by the way, spelled just the way you read a book, R-E-A-D.
That's awesome.
And Augusta Reed Thomas, she lives in Chicago. She's done many, many, many things. Her music has been recorded by Rostropovich and Marin Alsop and Sarandu Davis. Like many, many people have performed her work. And I contacted her literally out of the blue and said, "I've done this thing on Finnegans Wake. Would you be interested?" And she responded 7.5 minutes later, said, "Tell me more. I'm interested in Joyce." So I can go on at some length about this opera, but it's a curious thing, and not one. Just to let you know, as of this instant, not one note has yet been written.
Mm.
Gusty, the aforementioned Augusta Reed Thomas, is got lots of stuff on the go, and so she said I can really start tucking into this, but in 2025. So we're constantly in touch. Just to let you know, the idea is to have 15 minutes of music composed, performed, professionally recorded in Chicago by the end of November, beginning of December. At that stage, I'll take these 15 minutes from two areas of the opera and basically send it to the Met, Paris Opera, Santa Fe Opera, wherever, Turin, Dublin, Trieste, and basically say, "Here's 15 minutes of an opera which you don't really know about. Would you like to hear any more?" Just that simple question. And they'll either say, "Yep, sounds interesting," or they'll say, "Sorry, this is not for us." So
It's it's an extraordinary thing. I'm just sort of dumbfounded again. Like I already used that word, but
And the thing you will find is as you're submitting places, the places that you think you want, if they reject you, you actually don't want to be there anyway.
mm-hmm.
As a playwright who gets rejections all the time, I say every no brings me closer to a yes.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah,
and
exactly.
and I would rather a small company who's absolutely in love with the work
Yeah,
and willing to go 10 toes in with me, um, be there as opposed to being just part of a giant system that's like, yeah, and we have this thing, you know. The same amount of enthusiasm. I'm excited. I've actually just recently started to get interested into opera. Musical theater kid my whole entire life, and I watched an opera called Fire Shut Up in My Bones.
oh
I
yes,
love it's so good.
yes.
And then I was like, okay, maybe this is something for me. Luckily, some of my students are in operas, so I get to see them perform.
Did you
And
see the Met? Did you see the Met version of that?
I saw the Met version, yes.
Okay, okay, yeah, pretty amazing. Yeah,
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 and, I think that the thing that has caught me about opera is that there is an understanding of spectacle, right? In a way that I think is often shied away from in theater a lot of times now, and any part of the wake asks for like that ability to go grand in that way. So I'm super excited for you.
yeah, yeah. Thanks. Yeah, it to me it's kind of fun because it's a completely new world. As I say, I just I wrote this libretto, and it's very funny that you mentioned that in two or more acts. Uh, in fact, I've sort of talked about it, and people just ignore that idea. But you really, Toby, you really picked up on it, which is
When he told me about it, we both were like, or
in my own fertile, somewhat expansive imagination. I sort of almost think of two operas. One, the sort of 2.5 hour version, which would go wherever, and then maybe a 5-hour or a 6-hour version. You guys probably know that Einstein on the Beach.
Yeah.
Uh,
Oh, I love Einstein on the
by
Beach.
oh my god, by Philip Glass. It's meant to go on. It's meant to sort of happen, going on as you walk into the theater, and it's meant to sort of continue after you leave the theater.
Mm-hmm.
So, and in fact, uh, well, lots of things about Philip Glass, as well as lots of other people have been influencing me on this opera. Among other things, maybe some of your listeners will be interested to know, and they can just use their imagination. At one point in the opera, just at the beginning of the second act, I am asking 8 of the principal chorus members, 4 boys and 4 girls, or 4 men and 4 women, to disrobe and to sing, move around the stage, fully unclothed, naked, for about 6 or 7 minutes, and then they switch clothes. Going into it, they have different colors. The females have different colors than the males, and then they switch clothes. And then the instruction in the operas, the new people put these new clothes on, whether they fit perfectly or not, for the rest of the opera. And as you guys know, because I've mentioned sex a couple times already in this podcast, Joyce was really interested in gender, sex, metamorphosis. Obviously he loved Ovid, how people turn into trees, or trees turn into people, or people turn into rocks, and rocks turn into people, etc. And men turn into women, and women turn into men. So it's this nakedness, this nudity that I'm encouraging, is really quite central to the text. It is not gratuitous, and it really does complement what Joyce is doing. So again, there's lots of other stuff. I'm also asking for 25 dancers. Earlier, Toby, you mentioned the importance of rivers and water. So I'm asking for 25 dancers, and they are, in instructions, very complicated, as water. So I want people, as they walk into the room, they may, out of the corner of their eye, see something blue moving, just as they go find their seat. So I want that presence of water to be always there, and in fact, I want the dancers, to be present before the opera begins, and to be present after the opera ends. So again, like Joyce, that eternal, from beginning to end, water constantly recycling. I want that sense of that recycling, right, that blueness to be ever present in the opera.
Yeah, I think the choice of medium is really interesting as well, because I think there's a few different ways you could adapt this text, and we've talked about stage adaptation before, where there have been stage adaptations, short 1-hour adaptations of a corner of the text, but it's been mostly based around the Ewicker family. It hasn't gone into great depth. It's been sort of focusing on that, because theatre, obviously there are conventions depending on the genre that you're in, and opera is an interesting one, because opera is not only about speaking the spoken, but it's also about speaking the thought and speaking the internal life of the character, and sort of unpacking things and unraveling things. So that's what, an aria is very much based around really unloading the character's internal life for the audience, but then that it's also an opportunity to kind of unravel the wake and sort of look at the different kinds of ways that the text is coming in and out. And I feel as though, the 2.5 hour opera to cover 20 pages, it may not be enough time after a little while, because there's so many ways you can go and unpack. And I feel as though there's maybe a world in which you continue building on this. I think there's a Wagnerian wake cycle. Eventually, where collaboratively there are a series of operas that you can connect together, and then you could just continue to loop around, perform them 24 hours a day on Bloomsday.
Why did you mention Wagner? Because now I want to talk about Wagner for the next 20 minutes. Sorry, I won't, but just to let you know, the Met Opera in New York has just selected a fellow named Yuval Sharon to do the brand new Ring cycle at the Met.
Mm.
The 4 operas from the Ring, starting in 2027.
Mm.
And it'll go on for those 4 years. So it's and this guy did just a very interesting book called A New Philosophy of Opera, which I just reviewed for a journal in England called the Fortnightly Review, which was founded in 1865. And it was, the first editor was George Eliot's companion, George Henry Lewes. He was the very first editor of the Fortnightly Review. Anyways, so and as you just implied, Joyce loved Wagner.
Yeah.
He just
Yeah.
loved him. So
Absolutely. Yeah, I just love the thought of an opera version of the Wake that gets us into the end of book 4 too, and then loops straight back into River Run, and takes us back to the top again, and just
So
keeps
what do you? Can I
cycling
ask you
through.
guys a question? I know we're getting on,
No,
but
no, you're
what are
okay.
you guys planning on doing once you quote unquote finish your? I really do mean quote unquote finish your reading. What are you
Right.
going to do after that?
We have some ideas.
Yeah.
Yeah, go on,
Yeah.
TJ.
So one is I made a bet foolishly in the middle of the book that if Festi King showed up one more time, I would write a short play on Festi King. And sure enough, like 10 pages later, he was like, hello. So I've talked to Toby about writing basically an audio play about Festi King and us maybe releasing it as a bonus episode for the Wake. I will tell you it would come down the line because I have projects that are paying me that I have to take care of first.
Yep.
Um, for me, I've sat with it and I was like, this is a book that I think I need time to marinate in and then come back to. Um, because there's a level of literature that I've just started to engage with, and recently I've really started looking at the work of like Audre Lorde, and like I really want to take a deep dive into that sort of stuff.
Mhm.
And there also comes, at least for my creative process, a time of ingestion and then a time of pushing out. And I'm nearing the end of my ingestion time before I can say I just need to create, not in a vacuum, but without, things that would heavily influence my work. Let me work with what I got. So that's where I am. But the book isn't going anywhere. I'm not going to sell it to half price books. This is my copy. I have my post-its. There will be more post-its as the years go on. But I see it as one of those books that will be as influential to me as like Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man was to me when I discovered it in high school, where I have a copy. I don't read it every year, but I know when I need to, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I read the 4 quartets by T.S. Eliot. I don't know, once a year, sometimes more.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we've also talked about, because both of us are theatre people, and talking about adaptation, sort of maybe unraveling adaptation as a podcast, because we quite enjoy this format, and we quite enjoy digging into stuff and just chatting away together and getting a chance to see each other a few times a week, which is really nice. But whether or not, there's no real space in the stratosphere for a Ulysses version of this, because that already exists, and we're not really looking to recreate any work that anyone else is doing. The fact that this is the only full-length Wake podcast that exists is kind of cool, and maybe someone else will do a better version. There is a better version that's coming, with the Richard Hart version.
A
And
different
it's
version.
very, very different. But yeah, I also think that we're planning to end this podcast and then walk away. But then I guarantee you something will come up. Things come up in the media about the Wake all the time, or things come up about Joyce. Things pop up. I'm going to Ireland next year, so I'm sure there'll be a special Wake episode that'll come out of that. There's certain kinds of things that happen. So yeah, I don't think people are rid of us. The weekly updates may stop for a bit, but yeah, we really have found that this book started out as kind of a bit of a lark, to something to do, to just tick something off a list, and I'm slightly obsessed with it right now. I didn't sleep very well last night because I was fixated on this chat we're having today, and my wife is quite looking forward to me being done with it. So I have a book project that I've been putting on hold for months because my co-author isn't well, and so I'm going to get back to finishing that book, and then I have my job that I do. So
Don't let the jobs get in the way. Come on,
no.
Yeah.
Come on.
I am a librarian, so they're pretty understanding of such pursuits. But
Sorry, and on your T-shirt it says the word multiverse. Is that correct?
that's right.
Gee.
Yeah,
I wonder if that's somehow appropriate to this conversation we're having. I just wonder.
It could be. I'm wearing a T-shirt from the Disney Plus series Loki,
Right.
and it says Danger Multiverse, and so maybe that could could very much be.
Yeah.
Could be a reference. Even says Nexus on here. So there's certain kinds of the Wake is always speaking to us in certain kinds of ways. But, like when we first started this conversation, you said that we could probably talk for hours, and I don't want to keep you for hours, even though I'm sure we would all enjoy ourselves. I think we've come up with so many intriguing angles on this. But it's just terrific seeing all the work that you've done. You've got all this support of these heavy hitters who in the opera world who are supporting Pluribel and what you're doing, including Linda Hutchin, who was on my doctoral committee. I saw her there. She's a luminary of Toronto theatre, the opera scene, and so to see Linda's name on there. And Linda wrote sort of the central book in that, A Theory of Adaptation, which is maybe the book on adaptation. So Linda wrote that, and she was the third reader on my doctoral committee, and she's one of my favourite people. So I was very glad to see her name on there.
Absolutely.
I will say that your question about what's next, everyone asks us that, and I want to say that you are probably the person who got the most complete answer, because for a while we're just like, we shut the book and we walk away. But the further we got in, we're like, oh yeah, this is going to just be a part of our lives. One thing that we are going to do is we're going to get Wake tattoos. We're looking for phrases from the book. I have two contenders right now. I'm not sure where Toby sits, but
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm keeping my keeping mine under my hat for the moment. I got a few options, but I got to make sure it's a good one because tattoos are forever. Yeah.
Well, a quick suggestion: one of you could have away, alone, alas, loved, along the, and then the other one could have river run past even Adams from shore to shore to bend of bay. ... So hey, you guys do what you want. It's just a suggestion, okay? It's just a suggestion.
I'm not superstitious about a lot of things, but like matching or pairing tattoos, I'm like, and that's where the friendship or the relationship ends. I've seen it happen so many times.
I mean, maybe if we do get those two matching tattoos, that whenever we're in the same room together and put our tattoos together, we activate like the Wonder Twins.
Yeah. The tragedy is you'll do that and people will go, huh?
Yeah. Oh, yes.
What was that? Why you guys do? What does that mean? Blah, blah. But that's okay. Yeah. That's a separate. Yeah.
Yes, it is. Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for being here, Peter. It's been a real pleasure to meet you. Where can we find your work out there in the world?
Oh, well, I have a separate, you mentioned my website for the artwork. And I guess you could put on link there, peterobrienart.com.
Mm-hmm.
I also, I've edited or written 11 books and hundreds of pieces that I've published internationally about different topics. And that's at a separate website, tpob.me. Anyway, so and again, I what I hope is that some of the listeners now say to themselves in maybe 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years, I just found out a new opera on Finnegans Wake. It's called what's it called? Pluribel.
Yeah.
Maybe we should go to see that.
Absolutely,
so maybe that happens, but that's not going to be in the next couple of years. It's going to be a little bit longer than that.
There's always time for Joyce.
Exactly.
Well, that is all the time we have this week for Wake. We'll return next week to continue with our reading as we begin Book 4, as we continue pulling at the threads of this incredible text. I've been Toby Malone, joined as ever by TJ Young. Thank you, TJ. It's always nice to see you.
Absolutely.
Best of luck with the new semester.
Thanks, you guys. Thanks a lot.
It's been a real pleasure to have Peter O'Brien here with us. And as I said, I'm going to link to his various projects in our show notes. So we'll see you next week, sketchers and singers. This has been Wake, a cold reading of James Joyce's Finnegans Wake, just to hear it out loud. If you've made it this far, thank you for your dedication. Join us next week for another segment of Finnegans Wake and a chat about what we've found. Wake is a Moon Street Media podcast, engineered by TJ Young and Toby Malone. Our theme song is The Ballad of Perso Riley, arranged and performed by Meg Logue after James Joyce. Wake is recorded in Canada, where Finnegans Wake is in the public domain. For community and bonus content, join us at our free Patreon at patreon.com/wakepod. If you have questions about Finnegans Wake, don't ask us. We're just as confused as you are. See you next week.